My name is Philip. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in roles where consistency mattered more than charisma, operations, strategy, the kind of work that keeps companies standing even when no one is looking. I'm not the loudest voice in the room. I don't dominate meetings. I don't interrupt people to make sure I'm seen. If you met me back then, you might have described me as dependable, calm, maybe even forgettable. That's usually how people saw me. Useful, steady, but not someone whose absence would immediately cause alarm. I was the person you trusted with details, not decisions. The one who followed through, not the one who took credit. And to be honest, for a long time I was fine with that. I believed that if you did good work long enough, it would eventually speak for itself. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about humiliating anyone or winning some dramatic showdown. It's about clarity. How it arrives quietly, how it changes you, and how it sometimes comes too late for the people who assumed you'd never notice what was really happening. The title of this story could sound exaggerated if I said it out loud. My boss promised me equity. The contract listed 0%. It sounds like a clickbait headline, but it isn't. It's a factual statement, and what makes it more unsettling is this detail. I noticed it after resigning from my old job. What you're about to hear is a slow story, a measured one. There are no sudden explosions, no villains twirling mustaches, no moments where I raise my voice or slam a door. Instead, there's a series of small realizations, each one easy to ignore on its own, but impossible to deny when placed side by side. This is a story about how being underestimated can feel safe, right up until the moment you realize it was intentional. About how silence can look like loyalty from the outside, while slowly turning into leverage on the inside. And about how the most decisive moves often happen long before anyone realizes a decision has been made. I'm telling this now not to warn you about my former boss or even about contracts and equity. I'm telling it because many of us have been taught to be patient, to be grateful, to assume good intentions. And sometimes that advice costs more than we realize. If you've ever been the reliable one, the person who kept things together while others took center stage, I want you to listen closely. Not for drama, just for truth. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever looked back at a moment in your life and realized you understood it far too late? At the company, I was known as solid. Not brilliant, not visionary, just solid. If something broke, I fixed it. If a process was unclear, I clarified it. If a deadline was slipping, I stayed late without announcing it. People didn't praise that kind of work. They relied on it. And reliance can look a lot like respect until you notice the difference. In meetings, I was often introduced last, if at all. My role was usually summarized with a vague sentence. Philip helps keep things running. No one ever asked me to pitch the future. They asked me to explain the present. I was the translator between chaos and order. And once order was restored, I faded back into the background. I didn't resent it, at least not consciously. I told myself a story that made it easier to stay quiet. That the loud people needed attention, while the serious work happened elsewhere. That leadership noticed everything, even if they didn't say it out loud. That trust was being built brick by brick, invisibly. My boss especially reinforced that belief. He spoke in long arcs, vision, growth, what we were building together. He liked phrases like early days and long-term upside. When he talked about the future, he used we generously. When things went wrong, he used I sparingly. And when I delivered results, he nodded once, as if confirming something he already knew. In one-on-one conversations, he framed my position as essential but temporary. You're holding this together so we can scale, he'd say. Once we get there, everyone who stuck it out will be taken care of. I believed him, not because I was naive, but because the alternative felt cynical. And cynicism, I thought, would corrode the kind of professional I wanted to be. So I became dependable in a way that trained people not to worry about me. I didn't complain. I didn't threaten to leave. I didn't leverage offers. When something extra was needed, I absorbed it quietly. When credit was distributed unevenly, I didn't correct the record. That behavior has a consequence. Over time, people stop checking in. They stop asking how you're doing. They stop explaining decisions that affect you. Not out of cruelty, out of assumption. You become part of the infrastructure, necessary but impersonal. I noticed it in small ways. Calendar invites sent without context. Strategy changes were announced after they were finalized. Jokes about burnout that landed a little too close to home. When I spoke up, people listened politely, then moved on. Still, I stayed, because leaving would have meant admitting something uncomfortable, that my loyalty might not be mutual. And as long as I didn't test that assumption, I could preserve the image I had of the place, and of myself. What I didn't realize then was that I had already been assigned a role. Not officially, not maliciously, but clearly. I was the stabilizer, the buffer, the person who would understand why things couldn't be fair, yet the one who didn't need reassurance because he seemed so composed, the one who would wait, and waiting when it goes on long enough stops feeling like patience. It starts feeling like invisibility. The truth is I was good at my job, better than I let on. I saw patterns others missed. I documented decisions others forgot they'd made. I noticed how promises were phrased carefully, optimistic enough to inspire, vague enough to avoid obligation. But I kept those observations to myself, not because I was afraid, because I thought restraint was maturity, because I believed that staying calm meant staying honorable, because I didn't yet understand that silence, when unreciprocated, becomes permission. Looking back now, I can see how clearly defined my place was in their minds. I just wasn't supposed to see it myself. The first moment didn't arrive with weight. It wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no confrontation, no unmistakable insult that demanded a response. That's why it stayed with me. We were in a small conference room, glass walls, whiteboard still stained with old plans that had already been replaced. The meeting was supposed to be procedural, a review of responsibilities as the company prepared for its next phase. Titles were being adjusted, reporting lines clarified. Nothing on the surface should have mattered emotionally. Halfway through, my boss said something casual. He mentioned a new initiative, one I had designed, scoped, and quietly implemented over the previous 6 months. He spoke about it as if it had emerged naturally from the team. Then he turned to someone else and said, "You'll own this moving forward." "Not me." Someone nodded. Notes were taken. The conversation moved on. I didn't interrupt. Not because I didn't notice, but because I assumed there had been a misunderstanding. Maybe this was just temporary. Maybe own didn't mean what it sounded like. Maybe credit and control were two separate things. After the meeting, I waited for a clarification email, a follow-up conversation, anything that would restore alignment between what I knew to be true and what had just been implied. Nothing came. Later that day, I mentioned it lightly, framed it as a logistics question. My boss smiled in a reassuring way and said, "You're still critical to this. We just want to give others exposure." Exposure. It was said kindly, reasonably, almost generously. And I nodded because pushing back would have felt petty. Because correcting the narrative would have made me look territorial. Because I still believed that fairness didn't need to be defended. It would assert itself over time. That was the first small cut. It didn't hurt immediately, but it changed how I paid attention. After that, I started noticing the pattern. How ideas became team decisions once they succeeded. How my name disappeared from decks but reappeared in late-night Slack requests. How expectations flowed downward while acknowledgement flowed laterally or upward. No one else seemed bothered. In fact, when I tried to explain it to a colleague, they laughed softly and said, "That's just how it goes here. You know they trust you." Trust. Another word that sounded warm and felt hollow. What struck me wasn't the dismissal, it was how easily it was normalized. As if this kind of erosion was simply the cost of being steady. As if asking for alignment meant you didn't understand the game. I told myself I was overthinking it, that this was just one moment taken out of context. Those people were busy. That leadership had a lot on its plates. That making a note of it, mentally, quietly, was enough. So I made a note, not a complaint, not an accusation, just a line in my notebook. Date, topic, outcome. I didn't know why I wrote it down. I just felt an instinctive need to preserve the shape of the moment before it blurred, like pressing a leaf into a book, not because it's valuable, but because it proves you were there. Over the next few weeks, similar moments appeared, small, ambiguous, always explainable, always ignorable. A decision was made without my input on a system I maintained. A public compliment was redirected toward the leadership team. A promise framed as appreciation, never as commitment. Each one was minor on its own. Together they formed a quiet pressure, not enough to break anything, but enough to change how I stood. I began listening differently. Less for reassurance, more for structure. Less for tone, more for language. I noticed how often words like eventually, down the line, and once things stabilize were used in reference to people like me, people who waited. Still, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't withdraw effort. I didn't change my demeanor. Outwardly, nothing shifted. Inwardly, something had started to sharpen. Not anger, not resentment, awareness. And once awareness takes root, it doesn't need drama to grow. It just needs repetition. What makes subtle disrespect so effective is that it rarely announces itself. It arrives disguised as reason, as context, as patience is being requested from the same people over and over again. After that first small cut, nothing changed outwardly. I still showed up early, still stayed late when needed, still answered questions before they were fully formed. And because I didn't react, the pattern had room to continue. It always followed the same shape. Something would be decided without me, about work that lived entirely in my domain. I'd find out after the fact, usually through a passing comment or a slide in a deck. When I asked for clarification, it was framed as an oversight, never as intent. We just moved quickly. It was last minute. We assumed you'd be fine with it, and I usually was, or at least I acted like I was. Each time I told myself a version of the same story. This is temporary, this is just a phase, this is what growth looks like. I reminded myself that not every slight is a signal, that leadership isn't obligated to narrate every choice, and that being adaptable is a strength. Those explanations weren't lies, they were just incomplete. The truth was more uncomfortable. I was being treated as someone whose consent was optional, not because I lacked value, but because I lacked resistance. And resistance, I'd been taught, was unprofessional. So I normalized it. When a project I built was reassigned, I framed it as mentorship. When my workload doubled without discussion, I called it trust. When equity was mentioned vaguely, always in the future tense, I told myself that real rewards come later after sacrifice. I absorbed the language around me and used it against my own instincts. Others did the same, and that made it easier. When you're surrounded by people who are also compromising quietly, it feels less like compromise and more like culture. No one wanted to be the first to say, this doesn't feel right, especially not me, because I was supposed to be the calm one, the reasonable one, the person who didn't get emotional about business. So when something felt off, I looked for ways to neutralize the feeling instead of investigating it. I reminded myself of the early conversations about growth, about equity, about building something meaningful together. I assumed alignment where there was only ambiguity. Still, the pattern tightened. I noticed how often praise was public but shallow. How feedback was plentiful but direction was scarce. How promises were spoken conversationally, never written. How responsibility was clearly defined but reward was always deferred. And slowly I adjusted my expectations downward, not consciously, but behaviorally. I stopped anticipating recognition, stopped assuming transparency, stopped expecting follow-through. That's how disrespect becomes sustainable. Not through cruelty, but through adaptation. I became very good at working within that lowered bar. So good that no one saw a reason to raise it. What I didn't realize then was that by normalizing the treatment, I was also documenting it. Quietly, consistently, dates, conversations, language used, what was said, and what was notably avoided. It wasn't strategic at first. It was instinctual. A way of anchoring myself to reality when the narrative around me kept shifting. And the more I wrote down, the harder it became to dismiss the pattern as a coincidence. There was a role forming around me, one that didn't require explicit agreement, only continued compliance. I was expected to understand delays, forgive omissions, and remain grateful for proximity to the future I was being promised. And I did, until I noticed something else. The people who pushed back, gently, professionally, weren't punished. They weren't labeled as difficult. In fact, they were often accommodated. Their boundaries were treated as signals. Mine were treated as an absence. That was the moment something reframed itself in my mind. Silence wasn't being interpreted as strength. It was being interpreted as availability. And availability in this context had a cost. I didn't confront anyone after that realization. I didn't announce a change. I simply stopped rationalizing what I was seeing. And once you stop explaining things away, the truth doesn't need to shout. It just waits. It wasn't written anywhere. No one ever sat me down and explained it. But by that point, the role I was meant to play had become unmistakably clear. I was the reliable constant, not the visionary who needed to be inspired, not the negotiator who needed reassurance. I was the one who would figure it out, the one who didn't need details to move forward, the one who would absorb complexity so others could speak simply. In other words, I was useful in ways that didn't threaten anyone. When new leaders were brought in, I was introduced as support. When priorities shifted, I was expected to adapt instantly. When plans fell apart, I was consulted privately, but rarely included in the room where the next plan was formed. I wasn't excluded maliciously, I was categorized. People assumed I didn't need context because I'd always make it work. They assumed I didn't need security because I never asked for it. They assumed I didn't need recognition because I didn't seek it. And assumptions, when left unchallenged, become policy. I saw it clearly during a leadership offsite. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because of what didn't. I wasn't invited. Later, I was asked to implement decisions that had already been finalized, decisions that directly affected systems I had designed. When I asked why I hadn't been included, the answer came easily. We needed to move fast. Speed again, always speed. That justification did more than exclude me. It revealed the hierarchy. Strategy belonged to those who spoke early. Execution belonged to those who stayed late, and I was firmly in the second category. What surprised me wasn't the role itself, it was how long I had helped reinforce it every time I smoothed over confusion. Every time I accepted vague promises instead of concrete terms. Every time I chose harmony over clarity. I told myself I was being mature, that ego had no place in meaningful work. Those titles and credits were distractions, but underneath that story was a quieter truth. I had been trying to earn security through usefulness, and usefulness, when it's unlimited, becomes expected. I noticed how my boss spoke to me compared to others. With them, there was negotiation. With me, there was an assumption. With them, future rewards were discussed carefully. With me, they were implied casually. That difference matters, because what's negotiated is respected, what's implied is flexible. I began to understand that my role wasn't just operational, it was emotional. I was the person who wouldn't escalate, the person who wouldn't create friction, the person who would carry ambiguity without demanding resolution. And that made me safe to overlook, safe to delay, safe to promise without delivering. Once I saw that, I stopped feeling offended. Offense would have meant this was personal. It wasn't, it was structural. I was playing my part perfectly. And here's the uncomfortable part. Stepping out of that role wouldn't require confrontation. It would require a shift so quiet that no one would notice until it was already done. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me calm. Because when you finally understand the rules of a system, you also understand how to exit it. At that point, I wasn't planning anything. I wasn't plotting. I was simply observing with clarity, not bitterness. I was still doing my job, still showing up, still being reliable. But internally, the frame had changed. I no longer saw myself as someone waiting to be recognized. I saw myself as someone temporarily lending stability to a structure that assumed my permanence. And permanence, I knew, was an illusion. The shift didn't happen during a meeting, or a conflict, or a moment where anyone said the wrong thing. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, alone, with no witnesses. I was reviewing documents for a routine internal audit. Nothing dramatic, just housekeeping. Old files, agreements, and early emails. The kind of administrative work no one enjoys, which is probably why it landed on my desk. I remember feeling oddly calm, detached, like I was tidying up a room I didn't fully live in anymore. That's when I came across an early version of my contract, not the one I had been referencing in my head for years, the one shaped by conversations, assurances, and future-oriented language, but the actual document, signed, filed, quietly definitive. I didn't panic. I didn't feel betrayed. I just read it carefully, line by line. There was language about performance, about responsibilities, about termination, and about confidentiality. And then there was the section I had always assumed would be straightforward. Equity. The words were there. Clean, neutral, precise, 0%. Not to be determined, not subject to vesting, not pending board approval. 0. I read it again, slower, then once more out loud, just to make sure the meaning didn't change with sound. It didn't. What struck me wasn't that the number was 0. It was that I had never truly known the number at all. I had been operating on trust, memory, and implication, on conversations that felt sincere enough to replace documentation. In that moment, something inside me settled. Not hardened, settled. I didn't feel stupid. I felt clear about the difference between what had been said and what had been signed. Clear about how often the future had been used as a placeholder for commitment. Clear about how my silence had allowed ambiguity to stretch indefinitely. I closed the document and leaned back. There was no urge to confront anyone, no impulse to send an email or demand an explanation. The information didn't provoke me. It completed a picture that had already been forming. Everything made sense now. The vague timelines, the casual reassurances, the constant deferral of specifics. The confidence with which my boss spoke about taking care of people later. Later had never been defined because later had never been promised in writing. And that distinction mattered more than any emotional reaction could have. I realized then that this wasn't about deception in the dramatic sense. It was about convenience, about allowing someone to believe what benefited the structure without ever confirming it. And I had allowed it too. That afternoon, I didn't make a decision. I didn't plan an exit. I didn't change how I worked. But something fundamental shifted in how I understood my position. I stopped viewing myself as someone on a path. I started viewing myself as someone on a lease. Temporary, useful, replaceable. That awareness didn't make me bitter. It made me precise. From that day on, I stopped filling in gaps with optimism. I stopped assuming alignment where there was only silence. I stopped confusing good intentions with enforceable reality. And most importantly, I stopped needing validation from people who had already shown me exactly how they valued my presence. Clearly, consistently, distantly, and in writing. The shift was quiet. No one noticed. But it changed everything. After that day, nothing about my behavior changed on the surface. That was intentional. I still showed up prepared. Still responded quickly. Still delivered what was asked of me. Anyone watching from the outside would have said I was the same dependable presence I'd always been. But internally, silence had taken on a new meaning. Before, my silence was habitual, automatic, a byproduct of wanting to be agreeable, to avoid unnecessary friction. Now, it was deliberate, chosen, calibrated. I stopped speaking to reassure others. I stopped filling pauses with optimism. I stopped offering interpretations that softened reality. Instead, I listened. I paid close attention to how decisions were framed when I wasn't expected to push back. I noticed how often my boss used my steadiness as a given, how confidently he spoke about timelines that depended on my effort, without ever asking for confirmation. He hadn't changed. I had, and that difference created a subtle asymmetry. I knew something he didn't, that my silence no longer meant consent. Still, I didn't correct assumptions. I let them stand, not as a trap, but as information. People reveal more when they believe the ground beneath them is stable. I began documenting with more intention. Not just events, but patterns. Not just what was said, but how it was said and to whom. I noted which promises were repeated and which were quietly retired. I paid attention to what appeared in writing versus what lived only in conversation. It wasn't adversarial, it was observational. I wasn't preparing an attack. I was preparing clarity. What surprised me most was how my restraint was interpreted. My boss seemed increasingly comfortable, more casual. He spoke freely about future plans, assuming I'd be there to support them. He leaned on me more, not less. To him, my continued calm confirmed his narrative. Philip understands, Philip is patient, Philip isn't going anywhere. That assumption was useful because it allowed me time. Time to review policies, time to understand the company's financial structure, time to assess my actual leverage, not the imagined kind based on loyalty, but the concrete kind based on knowledge, access, and documentation. I learned where processes were fragile, where dependencies weren't obvious, where my involvement was deeper than anyone realized because I'd never made it visible. And I did all of this without announcing it, without posturing, without changing tone. Silence, when chosen consciously, creates space. Space to see, space to decide. I noticed something else during this period. The people who underestimated me weren't cruel. They were comfortable. Comfort dulls curiosity. It makes people stop asking questions, stop verifying assumptions. They assumed my presence was a constant, and constants in systems are rarely protected. That realization removed any remaining urge I had to explain myself. Explanation would have been premature. It would have converted awareness into conflict. I didn't want conflict. I wanted alignment with myself. So I stayed quiet. Not because I was afraid to speak, but because I was no longer obligated to fill the silence with trust. What they mistook for loyalty had become patience, and patience, when paired with clarity, becomes choice. Preparation doesn't announce itself. It rarely looks like ambition. Most of the time, it looks exactly like what people already expect. That's why no one noticed what I was doing. From the outside, I was still the same. Reliable, quiet, responsive. Inside the system, nothing appeared disrupted. Deadlines were met, problems were solved. If anything, things felt smoother, more predictable. That was the camouflage. What changed was how I spent my attention. I began mapping the company the way you map a building you might one day leave in the dark. Not out of fear, but out of responsibility to yourself. I learned where knowledge lived informally, which processes existed only because I remembered to execute them, which relationships depended on my mediation to function without friction. I didn't hoard information, I just stopped assuming it was shared. There's a difference. I reviewed old emails, especially early ones, the kind written before roles hardened and narratives solidified. I paid attention to how expectations were framed when the company was smaller, when language was looser, when promises were easier to make because consequences felt far away. I didn't look for betrayal. I looked for consistency. What I found was alignment, not between words and outcomes, but between incentives and behavior. Equity had never been formalized for me because it didn't need to be. My motivation had been sustained through implication, not obligation. That realization wasn't emotional, it was structural. I also began to understand my own leverage more clearly. Not leverage as a threat, but as a reality. I knew which vendors trusted me personally. Which internal systems did I fully understand? Which decisions had been made verbally and never revisited because they worked? None of that made me powerful. It made me informed. And information, when it's accurate and patient, changes the shape of choice. I documented everything with care. Not obsessively, selectively. I wasn't collecting ammunition. I was preserving truth, dates, attachments, versions, language that could be interpreted one way emotionally, but only one way legally. Still, I told no one, because the moment you announce preparation, it stops being preparation. It becomes a negotiation. And I wasn't negotiating yet. What surprised me was how often opportunities to clarify arose, and how easily they passed when I didn't pursue them. My boss would mention equity again, casually, in a meeting. Someone else might joke about when we all cash out. I nodded, smiled lightly, let the comment dissolve. Not because I agreed, because I no longer needed reassurance. They assumed my silence meant alignment. That assumption allowed the environment to remain unchanged. And as long as nothing changed, I could continue observing the system in its most honest form. There was a moment late one evening when I realized something that stayed with me. If I left tomorrow, cleanly, professionally, the company wouldn't collapse. But it would feel disoriented, not because I was irreplaceable, but because I had been quietly preventing small failures from compounding. That kind of contribution is invisible until it's gone. I didn't feel proud of that, or resentful, just aware. And awareness does something subtle. It removes urgency. I no longer felt rushed to act. I wasn't trying to win. I was simply positioning myself to leave without distortion, without rewriting history, without dramatizing my exit. They never noticed the shift because I didn't demand to be seen. And by the time they would have needed to notice, it would already be too late. The reveal wasn't a discovery in the dramatic sense. There was no single document that suddenly changed everything. No moment where I leaned back and thought, now I have them. It was quieter than that. It was the moment when all the fragments I'd been collecting, conversations, emails, decisions, omissions, clicked into a single, coherent understanding. I wasn't missing equity because of an oversight. I was missing it because the system had been designed to move forward without ever needing to give it to me. Once I saw that clearly, I stopped looking for validation in individual moments. I stopped asking myself whether this meeting or that comment meant something. Meaning had already been established, structurally, consistently, and over time. The leverage wasn't emotional, it wasn't even personal, it was factual. I understood how my role had evolved far beyond its written scope. I could show where responsibilities had expanded without compensation adjustments. I could trace how strategic decisions depended on processes I alone maintained. I could demonstrate how my departure would not be dramatic, but it would be disruptive in ways no one had modeled. Most importantly, I understood something about timing. Any conversation about fairness before I left would have been framed as a negotiation, as dissatisfaction, as a problem to be managed. The power would have remained with the people who controlled the narrative. But after I left, after I had already fulfilled my obligations, already transitioned cleanly, already removed myself from dependency, that was when the facts would speak without interpretation. This wasn't about revenge. I wasn't planning a reveal to embarrass anyone. I didn't want an apology or a correction. I wanted distance, enough distance that the truth could exist without being argued down. In private, I made peace with something that might sound counterintuitive. I accepted that I would never be made whole there, not because I didn't deserve to be, but because the system wasn't built to acknowledge that kind of discrepancy without pressure. And pressure would have required me to become someone I didn't want to be. So instead of forcing recognition, I chose to exit with clarity. That was the real reveal. Not leverage over them, but leverage over myself. I no longer needed to prove anything. I didn't need to expose anyone. I didn't need to confront the story they told themselves about me. All I needed was to choose the moment when my absence would be undeniable, and my silence would no longer be interpreted as consent. I didn't rush that decision. I let it settle, because once you see the truth clearly, there's no urgency, only direction. And direction, once chosen, doesn't need noise. By the time I reached the decision point, it didn't feel like a crossroads. There was no internal debate raging back and forth. No sleepless night where I weighed loyalty against resentment. That kind of turmoil belongs to earlier stages when you're still hoping the system might correct itself. I was past that. What I had instead was a list of options, each one clear, each one carrying a different cost. I could stay and finally speak up, ask for equity, present the documents, force a conversation that should have happened years earlier. That path might have led to partial recognition, maybe even a revised agreement. But it would have come with a price. I would become a problem to be solved, a risk to be managed. Whatever I gained would be framed as a concession, not respect. I could leave quietly and say nothing. Accept the loss as tuition. Close the chapter without disturbance. That option was clean, dignified, and incomplete. It would preserve harmony, but it would also preserve a false narrative. That everything had been fair, that no imbalance had existed, that my silence meant satisfaction. Or I could leave, deliberately, not explosively, not defensively, deliberately. That meant resigning on my own terms, fulfilling my responsibilities, documenting my work, transitioning knowledge carefully but not redundantly. making sure the company would survive, just not effortlessly. It meant allowing the consequences of my absence to unfold naturally, without commentary, letting people feel the gap without me needing to point at it. This third option required the most restraint, because it meant trusting reality to do the explaining. I sat with that choice for weeks, not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted to be sure my motivations were clean. I asked myself hard questions. Was I leaving to punish them? No. Was I hoping they'd panic? No. Was I secretly waiting for them to stop me? Also no. What I wanted was alignment between what I knew and how I acted. Staying would have meant continuing to play a role I now understood too well. Leaving without intention would have meant abandoning my own clarity. So I chose the irreversible option, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. Once that decision was made, I felt something unexpected: relief. Not excitement, not triumph. Relief. The kind that comes when you stop negotiating with yourself. From that moment on, everything became simple. Not easy, but simple. There was nothing left to prove. No argument to win, no outcome to manipulate. I wasn't exiting a company. I was exiting a story that no longer matched the facts. And once you do that, there's no reason to look back. Once the decision was made, I didn't announce it to myself with ceremony. I didn't mark a date on the calendar or count down the days. I simply began moving, quietly. Professionally, I reviewed my obligations carefully, not just what was written, but what was reasonably expected. I documented processes the way I always had, but now with a finality that changed the tone. Clear, complete, transferable, not indulgent. I stopped building anything new that only I could sustain. I focused on stabilizing what existed, reducing fragility. Not because I wanted to make things easy, but because I wanted my exit to be clean, unarguable. I also prepared, personally, updated my records, reviewed my finances, made sure I understood my own runway. There was no dramatic leap to the unknown, just a series of confirmations that I wasn't trapped. What I didn't do was warn anyone emotionally. I didn't hint. I didn't express dissatisfaction. I didn't fish for reassurance. I let the environment remain exactly as it had been, because that environment told the truth more clearly than any conversation could. My boss, in particular, seemed relaxed. He spoke openly about upcoming quarters, asked for my thoughts on long-term initiatives, included me in planning conversations that extended well beyond my intended timeline. I listened, took notes, asked clarifying questions, not because I planned to stay, because I wanted to understand the assumptions being made. Assumptions about my availability, my patience, my continued willingness to carry ambiguity on their behalf. Those assumptions were the foundation of what would come next. When I finally resigned, it wasn't abrupt. I gave notice, offered a transition plan, framed it as a personal decision aligned with timing, not dissatisfaction. The response was calm, almost casual. "Of course," my boss said, "we'll figure it out." And I believed him. They would figure it out. Just not immediately, not smoothly, and not without realizing piece by piece how much had been resting on someone they'd never fully accounted for. During my notice period, I didn't change pace. I didn't withdraw effort. I didn't grow distant. If anything, I became more precise. Every handoff was documented. Every responsibility was named. Every gap was visible. I wasn't trying to expose anything. I was letting reality take shape. No one panicked. No one asked me to stay. No one revisited old promises. That silence confirmed everything I needed to know. I left on a Friday. Clean desk, final email, no speech. Just a quiet exit from a system that had mistaken consistency for permanence. The first week after I left, absolutely nothing happened. That detail matters more than people realize. No emergency calls, no frantic emails, no sudden silence where my name used to be. The company continued moving with the same confidence it always had. Meetings were held, timelines were discussed. Decisions were made with the same optimistic certainty that had defined the culture for years. From the outside, my departure looked clean, almost inconsequential. And that reinforced the story they had been telling themselves all along. That I had been helpful, yes, but not essential. That the system was strong enough to absorb any single person's absence. That they had planned well, I imagine my boss felt a quiet sense of relief during that first week, not because he was glad I was gone, but because nothing immediately contradicted his assumptions. There was no moment that forced reflection, no disruption large enough to demand explanation, just continuity. That kind of silence is dangerous, not because it hides problems, but because it delays accountability. In the second week, the cracks didn't appear where anyone expected them to. There was no dramatic failure, no outage, no public embarrassment. Instead, there were delays, small ones. A report that used to land automatically now requires 3 follow-ups. A recurring task ran, but with slightly different numbers because a manual adjustment had been missed. Nothing that triggered alarm bells, just friction. People adjusted, they always do it first. Someone stayed late, someone improvised a workaround, someone said, "We'll clean this up later." And for a while, that worked. By the middle of the third week, the tone changed. Not visibly, not emotionally, but structurally. Questions started piling up instead of resolving themselves. Processes that once felt intuitive now required documentation that didn't exist. Meetings grew longer, not because people were indecisive, but because they were missing context they didn't know they'd been relying on. That's when my name began to surface. Not in accusation, but in reference. Philip used to know this. Didn't Philip handle that vendor relationship? I think Philip set this up originally. Each comment carried the same quiet implication. Something important had lived in one place, and that place was now empty. A few people reached out to me directly. The messages were careful, polite, almost apologetic. "Can you fix this? But do you remember why this was done this way?" I answered the first few, briefly, factually, without stepping back into the role. I didn't offer opinions, I didn't suggest solutions, I just clarified history, and then I stopped responding. Not out of bitterness, not to prove a point, because continuing would have erased the lesson. If I stayed available, the system wouldn't have to adapt. It would simply reroute dependency back to me, informally, and that would preserve the same imbalance, just with me on the outside. Inside the company, the discomfort began to compound, not dramatically, quietly. Initiatives slowed because no one was quite sure who owned which decision. Responsibilities overlapped, or worse, disappeared. Tasks were completed twice in some areas and not at all in others. People started documenting things retroactively, trying to reconstruct logic that had once lived in conversation and memory. That reconstruction took time, and time costs money. Leadership noticed the drag before they noticed the cause. They spoke about efficiency, about tightening execution, about growing pains. They didn't speak about me, not yet. It's uncomfortable to realize you were dependent on someone you didn't fully acknowledge. Much easier to believe the issue is temporary. By the end of the first month, that belief became harder to maintain. The problem wasn't that things were broken. It was that nothing flowed the way it used to. Every decision now required clarification. Every exception required debate. The quiet glue that had held mismatched pieces together was gone, and no one had replaced it because no one had realized it was there. That's when confusion turned into unease. Not panic, not anger. Unease. And unease invites review. I later learned that leadership began asking retrospective questions, not about my departure, but about how certain responsibilities had been structured in the first place. Why hasn't so much knowledge hadn't been centralized? Why did some systems have no clear owner? Those questions led to another realization, one that couldn't be softened. Much of what I had done was never formally acknowledged because it had never been formally defined. It had evolved organically, quietly, under the assumption that I would always be there to absorb complexity. And once I wasn't, that assumption became visible. I wasn't blamed. That's important. No one framed this as my failure or my abandonment. Instead, it was framed as an oversight, a gap in planning, a lesson in scalability. But lessons are expensive when learned late. New hires were discussed, consultants considered, processes rewritten. All of it required time, coordination, and a budget that hadn't been allocated because no one thought it would be necessary. The irony is that had my role been clearly valued earlier, defined, protected, compensated, the cost would have been far lower. But that conversation never happened. And now it was too late. From my side, I didn't feel triumphant watching this unfold. I didn't feel satisfaction. Mostly, I felt confirmation that my clarity had been accurate, that the system hadn't been malicious, just convenient, that my silence hadn't been interpreted as generosity, but as permanence. And permanence, once broken, reveals everything it was supporting. I heard bits and pieces through former colleagues, a delayed launch, a restructuring, a quiet acknowledgement that things felt harder than expected. No one reached out to ask me to come back. That silence spoke volumes. It told me that even now, even after feeling the consequences, the system still preferred adaptation over acknowledgement. Fixing the structure mattered more than revisiting the past. And that was fine, because by then I wasn't waiting for recognition. I was already gone, cleanly, fully, and without illusion. The consequences had begun, not with noise, but with weight. There's a moment in every system failure when urgency finally arrives. But by then, the window for real correction has already closed. That moment didn't come with shouting or emergency meetings. It came with a subtle shift in tone. What had once been framed as growing pains started being described as unexpected strain. What had been brushed off as transitional friction began showing up in forecasts, timelines, and quiet budget adjustments. The language changed first. The consequences followed. Leadership began pulling threads, not dramatically, carefully. Retrospectives were scheduled. Documentation was requested. People were asked to explain decisions they hadn't made, processes they had inherited without context. And slowly, uncomfortably, a realization surfaced. There was no single fix. They couldn't just hire someone new and move on, because the issue wasn't a missing role. It was a missing understanding of how much informal responsibility had been concentrated without structure. Replacing a person is easy. Replacing accumulated judgment is not. I later heard that my boss reached out to legal, not to confront me, but to review past agreements, to understand what had been promised, what had been documented, and what exposure, if any, existed. That review didn't produce leverage for them. It produced silence. Because legally, everything had been clean. The contract said what it said. 0%. Clear. Final. No ambiguity to resolve retroactively. That's when panic first appeared. Not outwardly, but in decision-making. Panic doesn't always look like fear. Sometimes it looks like overcorrection. Sudden process changes. New layers of approval. External advisors were brought in to audit workflows that had once been handled informally. A push for clarity that arrived only after ambiguity had already done its work. People felt it. Morale didn't collapse, but it thinned. Conversations became cautious. Initiatives slowed. No one wanted to be the next person whose contribution existed everywhere and nowhere at once. And somewhere in that tightening atmosphere, someone finally asked the question that couldn't be answered cleanly. Why didn't we lock this down earlier? There was no satisfying response. Because the honest answer, that it had been convenient not to, wasn't something anyone wanted to say out loud. I imagine my boss replayed conversations in his head, not with regret exactly, but with confusion, trying to locate the moment where things could have been handled differently without changing the story he believed about himself. That moment didn't exist, because it wasn't one decision that caused this. It was a pattern, a reliance on implication, a comfort with silence, a belief that good people would wait indefinitely. By the time they felt the full weight of my absence, the option to renegotiate, ethically, emotionally, structurally, was gone. You can't retroactively compensate someone to fix a system failure. You can only rebuild the system. And rebuilding is slow, expensive, uncertain. I was no longer part of that equation. Not because I refused to be, but because the moment when my presence could have been acknowledged properly had already passed. Too late to fix it doesn't mean too late to survive. The company survived, but it did so change. More cautious, less fluid, more aware of its own fragility. And awareness, when it comes after loss, always carries a cost. For me, that chapter was already closed. I wasn't watching for a regret. I wasn't waiting for an apology. I had already moved on, lighter, clearer, and no longer confused about where I stood. The system adjusted, but the relationship was irreversibly over. The confrontation, when it finally happened, wasn't planned. It didn't come from anger or strategy. It arrived the way most overdue conversations do, quietly, almost accidentally, when there was no longer anything left to protect. Several months after I left, my former boss asked if we could talk. Not urgently, not formally, just a short message that read, "Would you be open to a quick catch-up?" I said yes. We met in a neutral place. No office, no glass walls, just a quiet cafe where neither of us had authority over the other anymore. That mattered more than either of us acknowledged. He looked tired, not defeated, just older, more careful. We talked first about safe things, the market, mutual contacts, how fast everything was moving. The conversation had the texture of politeness layered over distance. Eventually, he said my name differently than he used to, slower. He told me they hadn't realized how much I'd been carrying, that it had become clear only after I was gone, that some things had been harder than expected. I listened without interruption. He didn't apologize, not directly. He didn't say the word equity. He didn't mention the contract. Instead, he said something revealing. "I wish we'd understood your role better while you were here." I nodded, not because it satisfied me, but because it was accurate. I told him calmly that I wished the same, that clarity earlier would have helped everyone. I had believed we were aligned for a long time because alignment had been implied, not confirmed. There was no accusation in my voice, no edge, just statements. At one point he asked, carefully, why I hadn't raised concerns sooner. I answered honestly. I said that I had mistaken trust for mutuality, that I had believed patience would be interpreted as partnership, that by the time I realized it wasn't, the only ethical move left was to leave cleanly rather than renegotiate under pressure. That answer landed heavier than any argument could have. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, almost to himself, "I didn't think you were unhappy." I didn't correct him, because unhappiness hadn't been the issue. Misalignment had. We finished our coffee. He wished me well. I wished him the same. There was no closure in the cinematic sense, no forgiveness scene, no resolution wrapped in understanding. But there was something better, accuracy. We both left with a clearer understanding of what had happened, without needing to rewrite the past to make it more comfortable. No heat, no winners, just truth, finally spoken in a space where it no longer needed to defend itself. I don't tell this story from a place of bitterness. That surprises people when they hear it. They expect anger, or at least a lingering sense of injustice. But what I feel now is something quieter and far more useful. Precision. I know exactly who I am, what I offer, and what I no longer confuse for respect. For a long time, my identity was built around being dependable, being the one who absorbed uncertainty so others didn't have to. I believed that steadiness would eventually be reciprocated, that consistency would be recognized as commitment. Now I understand something different. Consistency without boundaries isn't loyalty, it's exposure. Today I still work quietly. I still listen more than I speak. I still don't seek the spotlight, but I no longer rely on implication. I don't build futures on conversations that never make it to paper. I don't assume alignment where there's only goodwill. I ask clear questions early. I confirm terms. I treat silence as information, not reassurance. That doesn't make me colder. It makes me accurate. The biggest change isn't professional, it's internal. I no longer need to be perceived as good to feel grounded. I don't measure my worth by how much I carry for others. I don't confuse being needed with being valued. And because of that, I choose my commitments differently. I invest where responsibility and reward move together, where expectations are explicit, where trust is reinforced by structure, not sustained by hope. I haven't become cynical. I've become selective. When I look back at the version of myself who stayed silent for so long, I don't judge him harshly. He acted in good faith. He believed in patience. He wanted to build something meaningful without making everything transactional. That impulse wasn't wrong. It was just incomplete. Now, when I enter a room, I don't wait to be seen. I don't demand recognition either. I make my position clear through alignment, on paper, in action, and in timing. Quiet doesn't mean invisible anymore. It means deliberate. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. The most powerful shifts in identity don't announce themselves. They simply make certain situations impossible to repeat. I don't carry this story as a warning. I carry it as calibration. There's a temptation when a story like this ends to look for a villain, someone to blame, a single decision that explains everything, a moment where the truth could have been corrected if only someone had acted differently. But real life rarely offers that kind of clarity. What happened to me wasn't the result of cruelty. It was the result of comfort, of assumptions left untested, of good intentions standing in for explicit agreement. No one set out to take advantage of me. They just never needed to stop. And I never gave them a reason to. That's the quiet lesson at the center of this story. Not that you should distrust everyone. Not that loyalty is a mistake. But that loyalty without structure slowly erodes the very thing it's meant to protect. Silence can be noble. Patience can be wise. But when those qualities are one-sided, they stop being virtues and start becoming liabilities. What changed my life wasn't confrontation. It was documentation. It was reading what had actually been agreed to instead of what I believed had been promised. It was recognizing that clarity doesn't arrive through hope. It arrives through specificity. And once you have that clarity, you don't need revenge. You don't need validation. You don't even need closure in the traditional sense. You just need to act in alignment with what you now know. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. If something important to you only exists in conversation, it doesn't exist at all. And if your role in a system depends entirely on your silence, that system will never protect you. The most decisive moments in life don't come with noise. They come when you quietly stop negotiating with ambiguity. I'm curious to hear from you. Have you ever stayed silent because you believed patience would eventually be rewarded, only to realize later that clarity would have changed everything? Tell me in the comments. And if this story resonated with you, you already know why.